Sarah sat in the front row, her hands trembling slightly as she clutched the funeral program. The words printed on the page blurred in front of her eyes, but she couldn't bring herself to look away. This was supposed to be a day of closure, a day to say goodbye to her only son, Michael. Instead, it felt as though the ground had been ripped out from under her. The priest spoke about peace, about finding solace in the passing of a loved one, but Sarah couldn't hear the words. She was drowning in a silence louder than anything he could say. Her heart was heavy, and her mind was numb, barely able to comprehend the weight of the loss. Michael had been her everything, her companion, her confidant, her reason to keep going. They had shared so many memories, so many moments that defined who she was. Now he was gone, and in his place was this hollow emptiness that threatened to consume her. The grief was overwhelming, but it was the loneliness that cut the deepest. Michael had been the last person who truly understood her, the one person who had never judged her, who had always stood by her side. And now, as she sat there trying to hold herself together, the world seemed too vast, too cold without him in it. The room felt suffocating. The guests around her murmured words of sympathy, offering condolences to Laura, but none of it reached Sarah. It was as though she was invisible, cast aside in the wake of a tragedy that was too personal to share with anyone else. Laura, Michael's wife, stood at the front of the room, her eyes glistening with fake tears, her voice choked with emotion as she spoke about the man she had once claimed to love. But Sarah knew better. She had known from the start that Laura's tears were just that tears of convenience manufactured for the occasion. The woman who had married Michael was nothing like the one standing before the crowd now pretending to grieve. And then, in the midst of the ceremony, as the priest spoke of closure, Sarah felt a tap on her shoulder. Laura's voice, soft and smooth, whispered in her ear, "You have 1 week to leave." The words didn't register at first. Sarah froze her mind, struggling to process what had just been said. Her fingers tightened around the funeral program, the edges crumpling under the pressure. She didn't turn to face Laura, didn't acknowledge the icy chill that had settled in the pit of her stomach. She stayed still, staring ahead, pretending she hadn't heard those words, pretending she wasn't being cast aside in the cruelest of ways. The priest's voice was distant, and the room spun around her. Sarah wanted to scream, wanted to lash out at the woman who had not only taken her son, but was now trying to take the one thing that still held his memory, the house they had built together. But she said nothing. She couldn't. Not in front of all those people. Not in front of the world that had watched her son slip away and had done nothing to stop it. Sarah couldn't bring herself to turn around and look at Laura. She knew that if she did, she would see the smug satisfaction in her daughter-in-law's eyes, the same satisfaction she had seen the first time they had met, when Laura had wrapped herself in the image of the perfect wife, the perfect daughter-in-law. Sarah had never been fooled by her act, but she had never imagined that it would come to this. To Laura, Sarah was no longer a mother mourning her son. She was just an inconvenience, a relic of the past that needed to be erased for Laura to move on, to take control of everything Michael had left behind. The rest of the ceremony passed in a blur, and before Sarah knew it, people were filing out of the church, moving on with their lives while she was left standing in the ashes of her own grief. It felt wrong. Everything about it felt wrong. How could everyone just walk away so easily? How could they not see what Laura was doing? How could they not see how cruel she had become in her attempt to claim what wasn't hers? On the ride back from the church, Sarah sat beside Laura, her eyes fixed on the window as the car hummed down the road. The scent of Michael's cologne still lingered in the air. And for a moment, Sarah allowed herself to imagine that he was still there beside her, that this was just some terrible nightmare she hadn't yet woken up from. But the reality was harsh. Michael was gone, and Laura was making it clear that Sarah had no place in his world anymore. When they arrived home, the house was eerily silent. Sarah stepped inside, her heart heavy with a sense of foreboding. The house that had once been full of life, full of love, now felt hollow. Laura moved around her with practiced ease, setting down a glass of wine in front of Sarah with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was all so calculated, so rehearsed. Laura was already taking over, already making the house her own. Sarah felt as though she were watching from a distance, unable to act, unable to stop the tidal wave that was crashing down around her. She could feel it now. This wasn't about grieving. This was about Laura claiming what was left of Michael, about Laura wiping him from every corner of this house, turning it into a space that no longer held the memories of the life they had built together. And Sarah could do nothing but watch. Watch as Laura moved through the house with a coldness that only made the emptiness of Michael's absence more unbearable. For the first time in her life, Sarah felt completely alone, trapped in a house that no longer felt like home, surrounded by the echoes of a love that had been stolen from her. The days following Michael's funeral felt like they passed in a haze, a blur of empty space and hollow interactions. Sarah found herself walking through the motions of life, her body moving, but her mind remained far away, clinging to the memory of her son, trying desperately to remember the sound of his laughter, the way his eyes lit up when he spoke of his plans for the future. But now that future was gone. Her heart had been ripped out, and the pain was so overwhelming that at times it felt as if she were suffocating. The house that had once been a refuge, a place where Sarah had poured her love and care into every room, now seemed like a foreign place. Every corner she turned felt unfamiliar, every object out of place. The silence was deafening, but it wasn't the kind of quiet one expects after a loss. It was a silence of absence of a life no longer present. And yet it wasn't just the absence of Michael that left Sarah reeling. It was also the palpable shift in the air, the coldness that seemed to seep from every corner of the house. Laura's presence became a constant reminder of the emptiness. It wasn't just the grief that made Laura's presence suffocating. It was the way she moved through the house as if she had already claimed it as her own. There was no warmth in her gestures, no compassion in her words. She had made no attempt to comfort Sarah, no effort to help her grieve the loss of the man they both loved. Instead, she busied herself with rearranging the house as if trying to erase every trace of Michael, as if he had never existed. The family photos that had once been proudly displayed on the walls were gone, replaced with new generic artwork. His military medals, once a testament to his service and sacrifices, had been removed, tucked away into some hidden corner of the house. Sarah couldn't help but notice how quickly Laura moved to strip away the reminders of Michael's life, to replace them with her own narrative, her own vision of what the house should be. But the changes weren't just physical. Laura's behavior had shifted too. She no longer seemed like the woman who had once laughed with Sarah over cups of tea, who had shared stories about Michael's childhood. Instead, she was distant, cold, almost calculating. Sarah watched her closely, noticing the way Laura seemed to isolate herself more and more, retreating into her own world. At times, Sarah wondered if Laura truly cared about Michael at all, or if her grief was nothing more than a performance, a show put on for the sake of appearances. Sarah could see through it. The woman who had once been her daughter-in-law now felt like a stranger, someone she didn't recognize, someone who had taken advantage of her son's death to weave her own web of control. The tension between them had been growing, but it came to a head one afternoon. Sarah had been in the kitchen preparing a simple meal, trying to keep herself occupied when Laura walked in. She was holding a stack of papers, and her face was set in a mask of determination. "I think it's time we talk about your moving arrangements," she said, her voice smooth, but with an edge that made Sarah's skin crawl. "I've already made some calls to movers, and I think it would be best if you started packing up your things. It's time for you to go." Sarah's breath caught in her throat. She had known this moment was coming, had known from the moment Laura had whispered that ultimatum at the funeral, but hearing the words out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. This was her son's house, the house she had helped him buy when he had struggled to make ends meet. She had been a part of the foundation both literally and figuratively. This wasn't just some place she had been invited to. This was home. And yet Laura was standing there, acting as though it was her right to dictate who stayed and who left, to erase Sarah from the very place that had held so many memories. Sarah stood there for a long moment, the weight of the situation settling in. She wanted to scream, to argue, to demand that Laura show some respect, but she didn't. Instead, she took a deep breath and looked at Laura, her gaze steady. "This is my home too, Laura," she said quietly, her voice strong though it trembled slightly. "Michael and I built this place together. I'm not leaving." Laura didn't respond right away. She merely stood there looking at Sarah with an unreadable expression on her face. For a moment, the tension between them hung thick in the air, and Sarah could feel her heart pounding in her chest. But then Laura broke the silence, her tone softer, almost condescending. "I'm just trying to do what's best for everyone, Sarah. I know this is hard, but it's time for you to move on. Michael wouldn't want us to be at odds." Sarah's stomach churned at Laura's words. She could see the way Laura was trying to spin the situation, trying to paint herself as the reasonable one, the one who was simply trying to make things easier for everyone. But Sarah wasn't fooled. This wasn't about what Michael would have wanted. This was about Laura taking control, about her trying to rewrite the narrative of Michael's life, and by extension her own. With a heavy heart, Sarah realized that Laura had already made up her mind. This wasn't about grieving. This was about power, and she wasn't going to give it up without a fight. In that moment, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't going to let Laura erase her from the life she had shared with Michael. This house, these memories, they were hers too. And no matter how hard Laura tried to push her out, Sarah wasn't going anywhere. She would stand her ground even if it meant fighting for her place in a home that was being stolen from her. And so Sarah began to prepare. She wasn't just grieving anymore. She was preparing for war, quiet, subtle, but resolute. She knew that this wasn't going to be easy, but she also knew that she wasn't alone. Michael had left her something more than memories. He had left her the strength to fight. The days following the confrontation felt like a slow unraveling. Sarah moved through the house like a ghost, her footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, but the place no longer felt like home. The house once filled with Michael's laughter, his quirky sense of humor, and the warmth of their shared moments now felt cold and distant. It was as though the walls themselves had absorbed the loss, and every corner she turned reminded her of the space she was slowly losing. Each morning, she woke to the silence. The house was quieter now, the air heavier. The hum of life that had once permeated the space was replaced by an unsettling stillness, broken only by the occasional sound of Laura moving around the house. It was a strange kind of quiet one that settled deep into Sarah's bones, making her feel more alone than ever before. She would sit at the kitchen table, staring out the window, trying to remember the sound of Michael's voice, the warmth of his presence beside her. But it was fading, slipping away with every passing day. Laura's presence, though, was harder to ignore. Sarah could feel her in every room, her movements, her actions, a constant reminder that this house was no longer a place of refuge. It was a battleground. The more Sarah watched Laura, the more she realized how thoroughly she was trying to erase every trace of Michael's life. Photos that had once been framed proudly on the walls were now missing. The cherished books, the military medals, the personal mementos that Michael had kept gone, they were being replaced with things that felt unfamiliar. Things that had no connection to the life they had built together. Michael's chair, the one he had always sat in, the one that had witnessed so many conversations, so much laughter, now it was replaced with a modern, uncomfortable-looking chair out of place in the living room. Sarah couldn't bring herself to sit in it. It felt wrong, like she was being pushed out of a life she had spent so many years building. Laura's actions, her attempts to change everything, made Sarah feel like a stranger in her own home. And the worst part of it all was that she could feel Laura watching her as though waiting for her to leave, waiting for her to give up, to accept that she was no longer welcome. But Sarah wasn't going to do that. No matter how many changes Laura made, no matter how much she tried to erase Michael, Sarah wasn't going to let her. She wouldn't be driven out of the space that had once been filled with their shared memories. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in front of the family photos. They were gone, every last one of them. In their place, there were generic landscape prints, depersonalized and cold. A picture of blue mountains and empty snow-covered valley. It was beautiful, but it wasn't Michael. He had always been the one who loved to take photos, the one who insisted on capturing moments, preserving memories. And now, in the blink of an eye, all of that was gone, replaced by something that held no meaning for Sarah. She stood there for a long time, staring at the blank walls where their memories used to hang. She could feel the tears welling up, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't let Laura see her cry. Sarah had already shed enough tears. Now she needed to act. The more Sarah thought about it, the more she realized that she couldn't wait for Laura to back down. She couldn't keep pretending that everything would just work itself out. Laura had already made it clear that she wasn't going to stop. She was playing a game of control, trying to manipulate everything in her favor, trying to force Sarah out of a place that had been hers for so long. And Sarah wasn't going to let her win. It was time to take matters into her own hands. Sarah knew she needed to act quickly, but she also knew that she had to be careful. If she reacted too harshly, too quickly, she would give Laura exactly what she wanted, a reason to push her out, to paint her as the unstable one. No, Sarah needed to play this smart. She needed to be patient, to bide her time. The next morning, Sarah decided to take a step she had been putting off for days. She went into the attic where Michael had kept all of his old files. She had been avoiding it, not wanting to stir up more pain, but now she needed to find something, anything that would give her a claim to the house, something that would prove to Laura that this wasn't just a fight for space. This was her home, her legacy. The attic was dusty, filled with boxes that hadn't been touched in years. As Sarah sifted through them, her heart ached with every item she found. Old letters, photos of Michael as a child, his university degree. But then in the back of one of the boxes she found what she was looking for, a folder marked Home Purchase. She opened it slowly, her fingers trembling as she went through the papers inside. There it was, the deed to the house, her name clearly written alongside Michael's. She wasn't just living here, she was a co-owner. The realization hit her like a wave. She wasn't just some guest in this house, some outsider that could be tossed aside. She had every right to be here. Michael had made sure of it. And now Sarah had the proof to show Laura that she wasn't going anywhere. For the first time in days, Sarah felt a flicker of hope. She wasn't helpless. She wasn't powerless. She had been silent for too long, but now it was time to fight. Sarah wasn't going to let Laura take away her son's legacy. She would fight for it for Michael, for the memories they had shared. This house wasn't just a building. It was a part of her, a part of Michael. And she would protect it with everything she had. As she stood there, clutching the deed in her hands, Sarah made a silent promise to herself. She would reclaim what was hers. And this time, she wasn't going to let anyone take it from her. Sarah knew she had to act, but the weight of her grief made every decision feel like a monumental task. The loss of Michael had already shattered her world. But now, on top of her mourning, she was faced with the cruel reality that her daughter-in-law Laura was attempting to erase her place in the home she had helped build with her son. This was a battle that Sarah had not anticipated, but it was one she now had no choice but to face. She could feel the walls closing and the pressure of her own helplessness growing with each passing day. For days, Sarah had considered her options. She had been given the cold, unmistakable ultimatum to leave, and yet no part of her could bring herself to do so. This house, their home, was not just a building, it was a living memory of Michael. The scent of his cologne lingered in the air. The sound of his laughter still seemed to echo through the walls, and every object in the house held a piece of him. Sarah had helped create this life, and she couldn't let Laura simply take it away, not without a fight. But Sarah wasn't naive. She knew that in order to stand her ground, she needed to be strategic. She couldn't let her emotions, her heartbreak, lead her into a confrontation that would make her seem irrational or unstable. Laura was already attempting to manipulate the situation using the guise of grief to paint herself as the wronged party. If Sarah allowed herself to be swept up in the emotions of it all, if she let her anger spill over, she would lose the little power she had left. It was time to consult someone who could help her navigate this new reality. She reached out to a lawyer that Michael had recommended years ago, a man named Mr. Holt. When Sarah explained her situation, she was met with a calm, measured response. Mr. Holt didn't rush to conclusions, and he didn't promise a quick resolution. Instead, he listened carefully, taking the time to understand the complexities of the situation. And then, with a thoughtful pause, he told Sarah what she needed to hear. "You may have more of a claim to this house than you realize." Those words were a lifeline. They gave Sarah something to hold on to, something she hadn't allowed herself to believe she wasn't powerless. Michael had made sure of that. He had included her in the home's deed. He had made her a part of the foundation of this life they had built together. Sarah's name was there alongside his, and that meant she had rights. Legal rights. That knowledge fueled her, but it also brought on a new sense of responsibility. If she was going to stand up to Laura, if she was going to fight for her place in this home, she needed to be sure of everything. She needed proof. After their conversation, Sarah left the lawyer's office with a mix of emotions. Part of her was relieved to know she had a legal standing, but another part of her felt a deep sadness. It was strange. How could a woman who had once been part of a family, who had shared so many intimate moments with Michael, now feel like an outsider? How had it come to this? But those questions were for another time. Right now, Sarah had to focus on what she could control, and that meant gathering the evidence she needed to protect her home. The following morning, Sarah found herself standing in the attic, a place she hadn't been in years. The space was filled with old memories, boxes, files, keepsakes from Michael's life. It was dusty and neglected, much like the feelings Sarah had buried inside herself for so long. She pushed aside the sorrow and began to search through the piles, moving through the boxes one by one. Each item she touched brought her back to another time, another moment with Michael. She found photos from their vacations, letters they had written to each other, his old college textbooks. The memories flooded in each one, pulling her deeper into the past. But it wasn't until she came across a faded folder labeled simply Home Purchase that she felt her heart skip a beat. Her hands trembled as she opened the folder, the paper inside yellowed with age. She scanned the documents, her eyes finally landing on the one thing she had been searching for, the deed to the house. Her name was listed right there beside Michael's. It was as if time had stopped. She had always known she had a part in this home, but seeing the proof, seeing the official document, gave her a sense of ownership of something real and undeniable. This was her home too. For a long moment, Sarah just stood there holding the deed in her hands. The reality of it all sank in. She wasn't just an occupant in Michael's house. She was a co-owner. She had the right to be here just as much as Laura did. And for the first time in days, Sarah felt a spark of hope. She wasn't powerless. She had something that could help her fight for what was rightfully hers. She took the deed carefully, tucking it into her bag, knowing it would be the key to everything that followed. The legal battle was just beginning, but Sarah wasn't afraid anymore. She had the truth on her side, and she would fight with every ounce of strength she had left. She had already lost so much Michael, their shared life, but she wouldn't lose the home they had built together. Sarah knew this wasn't going to be easy. The fight ahead would be long, filled with challenges and painful reminders of the love she had lost. But as she walked out of the attic, holding on to the deed like a lifeline, she knew one thing for certain: she wasn't giving up. This house was hers too, and she would do whatever it took to keep it. The days after Sarah had uncovered the deed felt like a whirlwind of anticipation and dread. The house, once a sanctuary filled with love and memories, had become a place of tension. Every time Sarah stepped into a room, she was reminded of what she had lost and what she was fighting to protect. Laura, her daughter-in-law, continued to carry on as if everything were normal. Her movements calculated and deliberate, but Sarah could feel the shift. The house was now a battlefield, a place where two lives collided, each claiming the space as their own. As the days passed, Sarah started noticing more cracks in Laura's carefully constructed facade. Laura had always been charming, always the picture of politeness, but now there was something colder, something sharper in her eyes whenever she crossed paths with Sarah. Her smile had become tight-forced, and her attempts to avoid direct confrontation only made Sarah more aware of the manipulation that was unfolding around her. Sarah had always known Laura was driven, but she had never imagined how far her daughter-in-law would go to claim control over everything Michael had left behind. The more Sarah observed, the more she began to understand Laura's motives. It wasn't just the house she wanted, it was the story, the narrative of Michael's life, the legacy of their family. Laura was rewriting history, trying to paint herself as the grieving widow who had lost everything, as though Sarah had never been a part of Michael's world. But the truth was different. Sarah had been there from the very beginning, had shared every significant moment of Michael's life. She had raised him, taught him, watched him grow. And now Laura wanted to erase her from it. Sarah had always known that grief could make people do strange things, but she never expected this, never expected the woman who had once been a part of their family to turn so cold, so manipulative. It was during one of those quiet moments, when Sarah was sitting alone in the kitchen, lost in thought, that the full extent of Laura's deceit became painfully clear. Sarah had noticed it before, the subtle signs that Laura was trying to gain control. But this time it was different. This time it wasn't just the house that was being stolen from her. It was her son's memory, his legacy, that Laura was attempting to hijack. Sarah had been cleaning out the drawers in the study when she found the first clue. A small envelope tucked behind a stack of paperwork. It was labeled "Will Final Version." Sarah's heart skipped a beat. She hadn't expected this. She opened the envelope carefully, her hands trembling as she pulled out the document. At first glance, it looked legitimate, official, typed and signed, but something was off. The signature at the bottom didn't look right. It didn't look like Michael's. Her stomach turned. She had seen Michael's handwriting 1,000 times, and this wasn't it. She turned the paper over, inspecting it more closely. The date on the will was just days before Michael's death, and that made her heart race. Laura had been preparing for this. She had been planning to take everything from Sarah long before Michael had passed away. Sarah felt a sickening realization begin to settle in her chest. Laura hadn't just been trying to take control of the house. She had been trying to take control of everything Michael had built. The thought of Laura forging his will was too much for Sarah to bear. It was a betrayal of the highest order. Michael had trusted Laura. He had loved her. And yet here she was, using his death as a means to manipulate her way into a future that was never meant to be hers. Sarah's mind raced as she pieced everything together. Laura had likely known about the deed, about Michael's intention to include Sarah in the house, and had tried to cover her tracks with the forged will. But what Sarah didn't know was whether anyone else had been involved in this deception. Had Laura acted alone? Or had there been others helping her along the way? And why had she been so desperate to erase Sarah from the picture? The answers didn't come easily, but the more Sarah thought about it, the more it became clear she couldn't let Laura get away with this. She couldn't let her erase everything Michael had worked for, everything he had built with his own hands. Sarah wasn't just fighting for her home, she was fighting for Michael's memory, for the life they had shared. Laura might have been able to manipulate the situation temporarily, but she couldn't rewrite the truth. Sarah knew she had to act quickly. The next step was to contact Mr. Holt, the lawyer who had helped her before. She needed to expose Laura's lies to make sure the truth came to light. But Sarah was no longer just a passive observer in this fight. She was ready to take the next step, ready to reclaim what was rightfully hers. She wasn't going to let Laura destroy her family's history, and she wasn't going to let her tarnish Michael's legacy. As Sarah sat there in the dim light of the study, the forged will in her hands, she knew this wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming what had been taken from her. The fight was just beginning, but Sarah was ready. She had always been strong, always had the resilience to endure. And now more than ever, she knew she would do whatever it took to make sure that Laura's manipulations didn't succeed. The truth was on her side, and Sarah wasn't backing down. Not this time. The quiet intensity of the days that followed felt like a waiting game, a game that Sarah wasn't sure she could win. The reality of the situation had settled deep into her bones. Laura had crossed a line that Sarah couldn't ignore. The deception, the manipulation, it wasn't just about the house anymore. It was about a life built on lies, about a woman who had used grief as a tool to carve her own path. Sarah could feel the weight of what was happening and the frustration of knowing that everything she had once known was slipping further away with each passing moment. But she had a choice now. She could either let Laura take control, erase the memory of Michael, and force her out of the home that had been the backdrop to their shared life, or she could fight. It was a choice Sarah had been putting off for days, weeks even, but now there was no escaping it. She had to act. Her first step was to contact Mr. Holt again. The lawyer who had initially provided her with some semblance of hope now had the crucial role of helping her gather the pieces of the puzzle, of making sure the truth came to light. Sarah had already found the forged will, and now it was time to take everything to the legal system. She wasn't naive. She knew that the road ahead would be long, that Laura would fight back. But she wasn't alone anymore. She had evidence. She had a claim. She had the strength of her convictions. When Sarah walked into Mr. Holt's office this time, there was a different air about her. The nervous hesitation she had felt the first time they spoke was gone. There was no fear in her eyes now, only determination. She was ready to take back what was hers. She had been through enough already, too much really, and now she wasn't going to back down. Mr. Holt listened carefully as Sarah explained what had happened since their last conversation. She placed the forged will on the table between them, watching as he scanned the document, his face growing more serious with each passing second. It was clear he understood the gravity of what was at stake, but his response was calm, professional, and direct. "We need to move quickly," he said, his voice steady. "This is more than a simple dispute over property. This is about a deliberate attempt to deceive and defraud, and we need to expose that." The words didn't just reassure Sarah, they lit a fire within her. The thought of Laura using Michael's death as a means to rewrite the narrative, to take control of everything they had worked for, made her blood run cold. She wasn't going to let it happen. She couldn't. Not when Michael's memory was at stake. The next few weeks were a blur of preparation. Sarah spent hours at Mr. Holt's office gathering every piece of evidence she could find: documents, bank statements, receipts. She contacted the moving company that had been called to remove her belongings and learned that Laura had already tried to have them packed up in preparation for her departure. The realization made Sarah's chest tighten. It was as though Laura had already decided the outcome of this battle, already assumed that Sarah would walk away without a fight. But Sarah wasn't walking away. She couldn't. As the case slowly began to take shape, the full scope of Laura's actions came into sharper focus. The forged will. The misrepresentation of the house's ownership and the false narrative that had been spun around Michael's death. Each piece was a thread in the web of deception that Laura had created. But Sarah wasn't going to let it stay hidden. She wasn't going to let Laura tear apart their history, their memories, and everything Michael had worked for. It wasn't just about the house. It wasn't just about property or legal ownership. It was about respect. It was about Michael's legacy, and about Sarah's right to keep his memory alive. She had been there from the start when he was just a child, when he had grown into the man he became. She had been there for every triumph, every failure, every heartache. She wasn't going to let someone like Laura take that away, no matter how much she tried to rewrite the past. Sarah's resolve only grew stronger as the days passed. She had already seen the cracks in Laura's facade, but now those cracks were becoming wide enough for everyone to see. Laura's desperation was starting to show. The fake sympathy, the false narratives, the lies, all of it was beginning to unravel. And Sarah knew that the more Laura fought to hold on to her fabricated story, the more she exposed herself. The battle was far from over, but Sarah could feel the shift in power. The more she gathered evidence, the more she stayed calm, the more she refused to let Laura dictate the terms of this fight, the more control she regained. For the first time since Michael's death, Sarah could see the light at the end of the tunnel. It wasn't a victory just yet, but it was coming. And when that day finally came, when they stood in the courtroom with the evidence laid out before them, Sarah knew she had done everything she could. She had fought for Michael, for their family, for the home they had built together. She had fought for the truth, and in doing so, she had found something she had almost forgotten. She had her own strength. As the judge reviewed the documents, as Mr. Holt calmly presented their case, Sarah couldn't help but feel a sense of pride. The truth was on her side. It wasn't about winning or losing. It was about doing what was right. Laura might have tried to manipulate the situation, but Sarah knew that no matter how hard Laura fought, the truth would always have the final word. And in the end, it was the truth that would set her free. The courtroom was colder than Sarah had anticipated. It wasn't the physical chill in the air, but the heavy weight of the moment. Her breath caught in her throat as she sat in the wooden chair, her hands folded tightly in her lap. Across from her sat Laura, her face an immovable mask of composure, though Sarah could see the tightness in her jaw, the way her eyes flickered nervously whenever she glanced at Sarah. Laura was trying to appear unaffected, but Sarah could feel the undercurrent of desperation, the cracks in her carefully constructed facade. The judge had already called the proceedings to order, and the tension in the room was palpable. Sarah had prepared herself for this moment, but nothing could have truly prepared her for the weight of it all. The fight for the truth, for Michael's legacy, for a home that had once been filled with so much love. The courtroom with its cold, sterile air felt nothing like the house where she had shared so many years with her son. And yet it was here in this place that the battle for her future would be fought. Mr. Holt stood at the front calm and collected as he addressed the judge. Sarah couldn't help but admire his poise. He had been a steadying force throughout the entire process, helping her gather the evidence, helping her stay focused when it all felt too overwhelming. As Mr. Holt laid out the facts, Sarah could feel the weight of each word. The forged will, the false claims, the attempt to erase Michael's memory and her rightful place in his life. She wasn't just fighting for property, she was fighting for everything that Michael had left behind, for the family they had once been, for the integrity of their history together. As the proceedings unfolded, Sarah watched Laura. She saw the slight tremble in her hands, the way her shoulders stiffened every time Mr. Holt presented a new piece of evidence. It was subtle, but it was there Laura was losing control. She was being exposed, and Sarah could see the panic in her eyes as it dawned on her that the truth was coming to light. For a brief moment, Sarah felt a flicker of sympathy for her. Laura had lost her husband, yes, but she had also manipulated him, deceived him, and now she was facing the consequences of that betrayal. But that fleeting sympathy vanished as quickly as it had come. This wasn't just about Michael's death anymore. This was about the life they had shared, about the home that had been built with love and sacrifice. Sarah wasn't going to let Laura rewrite that story. Michael had always been fiercely protective of their family, and Sarah knew that if he were here, he would stand by her side, just as he had always done. She could almost hear his voice in her head, urging her to stay strong, to not let go of what was rightfully hers. Mr. Holt continued presenting the forged will with a measured tone, carefully explaining how the document had been altered, how it had been created after Michael's death, in a clear attempt to manipulate the outcome of the estate. He presented the deed to the house, the one that clearly listed Sarah's name alongside Michael's, showing that she had as much claim to the property as Laura did. Sarah could see the subtle shift in the room, the judge's eyes narrowing slightly, the way the opposing lawyer began to stumble over his words. There was no denying the evidence. There was no way for Laura to spin this anymore. The truth was too clear. As the judge examined the documents, Sarah sat back, her mind racing. This was it. the culmination of everything she had fought for. The stakes had never been higher, but in this moment Sarah felt an odd sense of calm. The battle had been long, but it wasn't over yet. She had to stay focused to keep her eyes on the prize. She wasn't just fighting for a house, she was fighting for Michael's memory, for the integrity of their family, and for herself. The judge's voice broke through her thoughts, and Sarah's heart skipped a beat. "The evidence presented here today is clear," he said, his tone firm. "The will presented by the plaintiff is forged, and the defendant retains legal co-ownership of the property in question. Any eviction claims are void." Sarah's breath caught in her chest as the words sank in. The fight wasn't over, not by a long shot, but in this moment it felt like a victory. The judge had recognized the truth. Laura had lost, and Sarah had won, not just for herself, but for Michael, for the home they had built together, and for the integrity of their family. But as she looked across the courtroom, she saw Laura's face fall. It wasn't just defeat. It was something deeper. It was the realization that her carefully crafted illusion had crumbled. For all her manipulation, for all her deceit, Laura had been exposed for what she truly was, a woman who had tried to erase everything that mattered. As Sarah stood up to leave the courtroom, she could feel the weight of the moment still hanging in the air. There was no real joy in her heart, no sense of triumph. The journey had been painful, and the scars would remain. But she had faced the truth, and in doing so, she had reclaimed her place in this world, a world that Laura had tried to take from her. Sarah knew that the house would never be the same again, but it was hers. It always had been. Walking out of the courtroom, Sarah allowed herself a brief moment of quiet relief. The truth had won. And for the first time in a long while, she felt like she could breathe again. She wasn't done yet, but she had taken the first step toward reclaiming everything she had lost. And that in itself was a victory. The morning after the courtroom ruling, Sarah felt a strange kind of silence fill the house, one that didn't echo with the tension of the days leading up to the trial. The air felt still, almost too still, as if the house itself were holding its breath. For the first time in weeks, Sarah allowed herself to sit in the quiet, the weight of the past few days settling heavily on her shoulders. The battle was far from over, but the victory, however small, had given her something she hadn't allowed herself to feel in a long time: hope. The judge had ruled in her favor. It wasn't a complete victory, not yet. Laura was still in the house, still trying to hold on to what she had tried to claim. But the truth had been laid bare, and Sarah had won the right to stay, to remain in the home that she had helped build with Michael. It was more than just a piece of property. It was the last connection she had to her son, the last place where his memory lived. In the aftermath, Sarah had expected a surge of relief, a rush of triumph. Instead, what she felt was an overwhelming sense of exhaustion, both physical and emotional. She had fought and she had won, but the price of that victory had been steep. The days of grief, of tension, of betrayal had drained her in ways she couldn't have anticipated. And yet, despite the weariness, there was a flicker of strength deep within her, something she had almost forgotten she had. As she sat on the couch staring at the empty space in front of her, Sarah realized that she had been waiting for this moment for a long time, perhaps even without fully knowing it. She had been waiting for the moment when the dust would settle, when the fight would be over, and when she could finally begin to heal. But the healing wasn't going to come easily. In the weeks that followed, Sarah didn't immediately relish in the satisfaction of her legal victory. Instead, she focused on the hard work of reclaiming her space, of rebuilding the life that had been disrupted by Laura's manipulations. She began to rearrange the rooms, not just the furniture, but the very essence of what it meant to live in a place that had once been so full of life, full of Michael's presence. The changes that Laura had made were small, but each one was a reminder of the power she had tried to take. So Sarah began to undo them slowly, methodically, putting things back where they had always been. One afternoon, Sarah found herself standing in Michael's old room, staring at the empty shelves that had once held all his books, his knickknacks, his little treasures. She reached for one of the shelves, brushing the dust away, and as she did, she felt the weight of his absence press down on her. There would never be another moment when he would walk into this room laughing at something silly or talking about the future that had been ripped away from him. Her chest tightened as the tears began to well up, but this time they weren't tears of sorrow alone. They were tears of recognition, the painful acknowledgement that her son was gone, yes, but also the understanding that she could still carry his memory forward. She had the right to mourn, but she also had the right to move forward, to live in the house that had been part of their life, to preserve the essence of what Michael had meant to her. It wasn't easy. The house no longer felt like it once had, not fully. Laura's presence still lingered in the hallways, in the rooms, and in the space between Sarah's breaths. But there was a difference now. The house was hers again in more ways than just legal ownership. It was hers in her heart, in the memories that Michael had left behind, in the way she would move forward slowly, deliberately rebuilding a life that was hers to live. Laura had left, though, not without leaving behind the traces of her deceit. She had packed her things hurriedly, her face pale, and drawn her eyes filled with something Sarah couldn't quite place. Desperation, perhaps, or regret. But she was gone, and Sarah, for the first time in a long time, felt a sense of finality. The battle had been fought, and while the scars remained, they weren't as deep as they had been. There was peace now, peace that had come at a great cost, but peace nonetheless. That evening, as Sarah sat alone in the kitchen, her fingers wrapping around the warm cup of tea in her hands, she allowed herself to breathe. For the first time in months, she wasn't looking over her shoulder, waiting for the next confrontation, the next lie to unravel. She could breathe. The house was quiet, but it wasn't empty. It was filled with memories. Memories of Michael, of the life they had shared, and of the strength she had found within herself to fight for it. The next morning, Sarah woke to the sound of birds singing outside, the sun streaming through the windows in a soft golden glow. The house felt different today, lighter somehow. Sarah stood at the window looking out at the garden that Michael had once tended with such care. It was overgrown now, the flowers and plants a little wild, but there was something beautiful in the way it had all grown untamed and free. She smiled a small, quiet smile. This was her home. It had always been. And now, for the first time since Michael's death, Sarah felt as though she could truly begin to heal. The past could never be erased, but the future was hers to shape. She wasn't done grieving, not by a long shot, but she had reclaimed her life, and in doing so, she had found a peace she never thought she would have again. As Sarah stepped outside into the morning light, she knew that the road ahead would still have its challenges. There would be moments of sorrow, moments of doubt, but there would also be moments of joy, moments of healing, and moments when the house once filled with conflict would again be filled with life. And for the first time in a long time, Sarah felt ready to walk that path.